Medusa wasn't born a monster. She was punished for being someone else's victim, and this channel has already mentioned pieces of her story from 3 other angles: Poseidon's, Athena's, and Hermes's. This is where every one of those threads finally comes together, told from the one perspective nobody usually bothers with: hers. Before she was a monster, Medusa was, by most ancient accounts, a beautiful mortal woman serving as a priestess in one of Athena's own temples. Ovid's version of her story, the most detailed and most widely known today, describes her as renowned specifically for her beautiful hair, a detail that becomes deeply significant and deeply cruel once you know what happens to it. As a priestess of Athena, Medusa had taken a vow of chastity, devoting herself entirely to the goddess she served. Even her curse itself carries a disputed motive depending on which ancient source you trust. Ovid frames Athena's fury as protective outrage at what happened in her temple. Other earlier traditions frame it instead as plain jealousy, a goddess punishing a mortal woman for being more beautiful than her. Both versions were told about the same event by people who lived centuries apart, and neither one bothered asking Medusa which was closer to true. This channel already told part of this story from Poseidon's side in his own episode. Poseidon pursued Medusa inside Athena's own temple, a direct violation of both Medusa's vow and the sacred space itself. Athena's response is the actual turning point of Medusa's entire mythology, and it's worth sitting with directly. Rather than punishing Poseidon, a fellow Olympian she had no real power to touch, Athena punished Medusa, the mortal victim, transforming her famous hair into living serpents and cursing her gaze so that anyone who looked directly at her turned to stone. Medusa had 2 sisters, Stheno and Euryale, Gorgons from birth, immortal and monstrous. Never cursed the way Medusa had been, simply born that way. Hesiod's Theogony describes all 3 Gorgon sisters with the same traditional features: serpents for hair, bronze hands, golden wings, and boar-like tusks, a description that makes clear Medusa's curse didn't just give her snakes for hair, it forced her into looking like her sisters had always looked naturally. Unlike them, Medusa alone was mortal, and alone had once been fully human. The 3 lived together in exile at the edge of the known world, cut off from mortal and divine society alike. Medusa now trapped in a body that made real connection with anyone, even someone who meant her no harm, permanently impossible. Medusa's death begins with someone else's ambition entirely, and even that part of the story starts with a trick rather than a heroic calling. King Polydectes wanted Perseus's mother, Danae, for himself, and threw a banquet where every guest was expected to arrive with an expensive gift of horses. Perseus, too poor to bring one, boasted in front of the whole court that he'd bring back something far more impressive instead: the head of Medusa. Polydectes held him to it immediately, fully expecting the boast to get the young man killed. To pull it off, Perseus first had to track down the Gorgons at all, and did it by cornering the Graeae, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them, refusing to return either until they told him where to find the nymphs holding the tools he'd actually need. That led him to an extraordinary set of gifts from the gods: winged sandals from Hermes, already covered in his own episode; a polished, mirrored shield from Athena, already covered in hers; a helm of invisibility, on loan from Hades himself; and an adamantine sickle, forged for the task at Hephaestus's own smithy, sharp enough to cut through anything it touched. Before the beheading itself, it's worth pausing on how carefully Perseus had to move. Medusa's curse worked on anyone who met her eyes directly, sleeping or awake, meaning the single hardest part of this entire mission wasn't finding her. It was approaching a cursed, exiled, grieving woman without ever once looking directly at her face. Several ancient depictions show Athena standing directly at Perseus's side during the act itself, physically guiding his hand and the angle of the mirrored shield, an image that makes the beheading look less like one man's solo heroics and more like the goddess who created this entire curse, personally overseeing its final chapter. Before the exact moment, two entirely different beings are born from one single death. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Using Athena's mirrored shield to track Medusa's reflection instead of looking at her directly, Perseus approached while she slept and beheaded her with a single stroke of the sickle. At the exact instant of her death, two beings sprang fully formed from her severed neck: the winged horse Pegasus and the giant warrior Chrysaor, both of them Poseidon's own children, conceived during the same temple encounter that had led to her curse in the first place. Medusa's death and her children's birth happened in the very same moment. Even severed, Medusa's power stayed fully active. Perseus carried her head in a specially enchanted bag to keep himself safe, then used it as a weapon through the rest of his own myth, turning King Polydectes and his entire court to stone for the crime that had started this whole mission, and later petrifying a sea monster to rescue the Princess Andromeda. Eventually, Perseus gave the head to Athena, who mounted it directly onto her own shield, the Aegis, wearing the face of a curse she herself had created as a permanent symbol of her own power, a detail this channel already covered from her side in the Athena episode. Medusa's power extended even into her bloodstream. According to later myths, blood drawn from the right side of her body could kill instantly, while blood drawn from her left side could raise the dead. Asclepius, the god of medicine and son of Apollo, already covered in the Apollo episode, reportedly used Medusa's blood in his own healing practice, eventually resurrecting the dead so successfully it disturbed the natural order enough that Zeus stepped in directly, striking Asclepius down with a single thunderbolt to stop the resurrections outright. Even in death, dismembered and displayed on another god's shield, Medusa remained one of the most genuinely powerful figures in the entire Greek pantheon, powerful enough that her own blood killed one god's favorite mortal healer for using it too well. Medusa's power didn't stay contained to Athena's shield. Long before and long after Perseus's myth was fully told the way we know it today, her face, called a Gorgonian by the ancient Greeks, was carved and painted onto temple pediments, doorways, coins, armor, and household objects across the entire Greek world, treated as a protective symbol meant to ward off evil rather than a villain's portrait. That practice never fully went away. A stylized Gorgon head still sits at the center of the flag of Sicily today, the exact same protective role her face carried 3,000 years ago, just moved from a temple pediment to a modern national symbol. A curse that was never hers to begin with ended up guarding thousands of homes and buildings that had nothing to do with her actual story. The most detailed account of Medusa's transformation from mortal to monster comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses, written centuries after the earliest Greek sources, which largely describe her as simply a monstrous Gorgon with no tragic backstory attached. Earlier sources, including Hesiod's Theogony, describe the Gorgon sisters with far less sympathy and far less detail. Ovid's more sympathetic version, a beautiful woman punished for someone else's crime, is a Roman-era reinterpretation, not necessarily how the earliest Greek audiences understood her at all, which says something about how myths themselves shift to reflect the values of whoever happens to be retelling them. That shift didn't stop in antiquity. In recent decades, Medusa has been increasingly reclaimed as a symbol of survivor rage rather than monstrousness. In 2020, a bronze statue titled Medusa with the Head of Perseus, showing Medusa standing over Perseus's severed head rather than the other way around, was installed directly across the street from a New York City courthouse during the height of the #MeToo movement, a deliberate, very public reversal of a 3,000-year-old story about a victim being punished instead of the god who wronged her. It's not the only place her face still shows up unexpectedly. The fashion house Versace has used a Medusa head as its official logo since the label's founding, a small, strange piece of the same 3,000-year-old apotropaic tradition from Scene 10, still doing the exact same job of catching a stranger's eye, just on a handbag instead of a temple wall. Every thread of Medusa's story connects directly to gods this channel has already covered. Cursed by Athena, violated by Poseidon, beheaded with tools from Hermes, Hades, and Hephaestus, her children fathered by Poseidon, her own face eventually worn by the very goddess who cursed her. Of every god and monster in this entire pantheon, Medusa's story is the one most thoroughly shaped by everyone except herself, which might be exactly why, 3,000 years later, people are finally starting to ask what she would have said if anyone had ever bothered to ask her directly. That closes out this channel's Olympian season. There's still more of this world left to tell. Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Demeter, and Dionysus each get their own episode next before this channel moves on to an entirely new mythology. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next.